what trips people up so often is the flip side of ego, which is just you thinking about yourself and worrying about what people are thinking about you when really everyone's thinking about themselves and not about you. So I think that where I'm going with that is, when you're going to a conference, I think so many people are like, oh, what will I say if somebody asks me this? Or what will people think about this? And honestly, nobody's really thinking that much about you.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with Jessie Kwak about creating your own community. Our conversation was triggered by the fact that Jessie recently hosted the first Author Alchemy Summit, and I wanted to find out what had made her decide to dive into this huge community-building undertaking. But even if organizing your own conference isn't on your bucket list, the best practices she shares are generalizable to all sorts of other big projects that might be on your wish list. Testing your commitment to a major undertaking, the importance of engaging a team of helpers, the challenge of delegation, battling imposter syndrome, gathering supporters and offering them opportunities rather than asking for favors, achieving balance with the rest of your work, the importance of avoiding task switching, and following the flow of your energy. And now let's hear from Jessie Kwak about creating your own community. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Jessie Kwak. Hey, Jessie, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing great.
I am pleased to have you back and to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you. Jessie Kwak is an author and business book ghostwriter living in Portland, Oregon. When she's not writing, she can be found sewing, mountain biking, or out exploring new worlds, both at home and abroad. She's the author of a supernatural thriller, 2 series of space scoundrel sci-fi crime novels, and a handful of productivity books, including From Chaos to Creativity and From Big Idea to Book. And in fact, Jessie was a guest back in episode 132 talking about From Big Idea to Book. She has also been on episode 179, Is Freelance Copywriting for You? And to that biography, we can now add conference organizer. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about, I'm kind of framing this up as creating your own community. And I had 2 reasons behind inviting Jessie on here. One was that I just think it would be interesting for conference attendees to see what goes into creating a conference. But I also think that this whole idea of taking that step to actually create your own community is really generalizable beyond specifics to conferences. So we're going to be kind of covering both those aspects, some that are more conference organizational specific, but some that are more generalizable to creating one's own community in general. And so, Jessie, let's just start out. If you can give a little description of the conference that you just organized.
Yeah, so the Author Alchemy Summit was held here in Portland, Oregon, about 3 weeks ago from when we're recording this. It was the end of February. And it was a small, kind of intimate conference. There were about 60 people there, from including speakers and staff. And the focus was entirely on business of writing and specifically around how to connect directly with your readers. So I used that question as kind of a focal point for, we could have talked about anything from ads to newsletters to craft. And I thought, okay, if we have a single track of programming, it's going to be a small community. We really need a focus. And to me, connecting directly with your readers is a question that a lot of authors are trying to figure out how to answer these days.
And what made you decide to start your own conference versus looking through the available suite of conferences for when you could go to as an attendee?
Yeah, I attend a lot of conferences and I really enjoy it. I love the community. I love networking. And I've been to a lot of kind of the bigger ones. I've been to 20 Books in Vegas, which is, of course, probably about the biggest conference that you can get into as a writer. And then I've been to some very small ones, some, local writing retreats or kind of craft focused critique group sorts of things. And I didn't find a lot that was really in this more middle ground, under 100 people, really kind of more focused tightly on the networking and community, as well as having a high level of educational content. And specifically, it's been very hard for me to find one that's so business focused. A lot of conferences the local conferences, at least in the Pacific Northwest, tend to be a lot more focused on the craft and the writing, or they're either, very genre oriented. Like we have some great local sci-fi cons and horror cons and things like that. But as far as something that was of that size, that was really focused on community and really focused on the business aspect, there just wasn't really anything like that in the Pacific Northwest, at least.
And I think this is a good opportunity to talk about how conference attendees can benefit from this conversation. And that is when you were researching conferences that where you were looking for what you just described and you weren't really finding it. When people are looking for the conferences that are going to be a good match for what they want, do you have any transferable advice where you can say, these are the things you should be focusing on to make sure that a conference matches the goal that you have for it?
Yeah, I think really knowing what your goal is, of course, is the first step. And so, are you looking for a place where you'll get a chance to actually maybe pitch to agents? You're not going to find that at a more indie conference. You're going to want to look for a more traditionally focused conference for that. Are you looking for, a wide variety of topics? You're not going to find that at a small conference, but you're not going to find as much networking opportunity at the bigger conference, maybe as you would at the small conference, or at least the opportunity to spend a lot of amount of time with people over and over. So I would say really know your goals and then talk to people who have attended in the past. That's, I think, a really, really great way to get an idea for, is this for me? Is this going to be valuable for me in my genre? Is this going to be valuable for me on my career path, whether I'm indie or trad? What is the vibe? Some conferences, I think they've maybe been around for a while and they can be a little, I don't want to say cliquish, but a little hard to break into as a new person who you walk in and you're like, it's a small conference and everybody already knows everybody. And now I don't know who to talk to because they're all very, their own private groups.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, talking to people who've been to try to get a sense of the vibe can be really valuable.
So let's talk through sort of the logistics of setting this up. And as we talk, I'm sure I'm going to have questions for you about how this is generalizable beyond conference organizing itself. But describe a little bit how you went from I'm not really seeing what I need out there to let's put on a show.
Well, I tapped into my network and just really started asking anybody I knew who had any sort of conference organizing experience to meet with me, talk me through the steps, try to talk me out of it. I mean, that was one of my big questions when I met with somebody. It said, okay, let me tell you my idea. I'd love to hear your take on what that looks like and poke as many holes as you can as possible. I would love to leave one of these conversations being like, phew, I dodged a bullet on that one. Now I don't have to organize a conference. I can just stay writing my books. But with every single conversation I kept having, it was just more and more me clarifying my idea and thinking, no, this sounds great. This sounds doable, actually. And in the end, I had talked to enough people that I was like, well, I guess I'm putting a down payment on this event space. And once I did that, then I was stuck.
Well, I think that is obviously generalizable advice that anytime you're thinking about doing something that is really a big leap, like it's going to take a lot of time or a lot of money or a lot of effort or a lot of whatever, I really like that idea of going to people who know and say, try to talk me out of it. Going in with a certain mindset that yeah, I can imagine certain personalities the first time they heard a reason that they shouldn't, they would say, oh, you're right, I shouldn't. But that is really a great way of sort of solidifying that this is something that you really want to do. So what
Yeah.
was it like to make that step where you were completely committed?
Oh, it was scary. It was that's I think the part that took me the longest was just getting to a point where I was like, all right, we have this space. I need to sign this contract. Is or what are the gotchas in the contract that I need to be careful of? And that was again someplace where I could go to a local friend who organizes a local, more traditional writers conference and say, can you read over this hotel contract and just make sure that there's no clauses that I'm missing? So that was extremely valuable to have. Again, I guess just going back to the having people you can go to and say, oh my gosh, look this over for me is so confidence building. But once I made that step and once I paid that deposit, it felt like, okay, well, now I have to learn how to market a conference. Okay. All right. I learned how to find an event space. Check. Now, what's the next thing I need to learn to do? So it was very much just building this conference as I was flying it, I suppose.
And obviously, you weren't doing this all on your own. You've mentioned a couple of times this idea of tapping into people who are experts. Did it boil down to you were really the sole organizer and you were going to people for expertise, or did you engage a team of people who are helping you out more actively?
It was essentially I was the sole organizer who was asking for expertise. My husband helped quite a bit near the end. He was also my person where I got to bounce ideas off along the way. But he acted as essentially the logistic coordinator during the event itself, which was fantastic because then I could focus on the networking part and moderating panels and making sure the speakers were all taken care of. And if somebody had a question about, what time is the next thing, Rob was taking care of them, which was great. The other person who I kind of brought onto my team was my next door neighbor, Lydia. And she took charge of the catering for us, which was amazing. Lydia has been hearing me talk about this for ages. We've been friends. We've been living in this house for about 10 years. So we've been friends for a long time. And she's very organized and thoughtful and, sees all the different things that might need to happen. If you say, we need this for lunch, she's like, well, who has allergies? Who's got this? She's got that mind, which is amazing. And so when I asked her to come on as the catering director, I we had a meeting about it. And then a few days later, she texted me and said, hey, can I come over after dinner tonight? I have some things I want to show you. And she showed up with spreadsheets and like a Pinterest board of all the different ways food could be laid out. And I was just like, I have chosen the right person.
Yeah, it seems like you lucked into two good helpers there. Was delegating that kind of work to somebody else? Did that come naturally to you, or was that something that you struggled with?
That's Delegating is really hard for me. And it was especially hard for me in this case because I didn't often know what I needed. And so people kept asking, like, what can I help you with? And I'm like, I don't really know. I don't know what I'm doing. So I don't really know how to say, can you take this part of what I'm doing and start working on it? So that's something that I think will be a little bit easier. I will be doing this in 2025 as well. So for the second time around, I now can say, okay, I know what it takes for that discrete project, and I can probably hand that off. But because I was feeling my way through so much of it, it was very difficult to delegate.
Yeah, I think there are all sorts of analogies there for someone that's a writer and now they're getting ready to publish a book and now they have to suddenly understand book cover design, not doing it themselves, but hopefully working with someone effectively on that. Or now they're going to be diving into the editorial world. You just got to kind of get your feet wet, I guess, to fully understand what's involved and what you can and cannot comfortably delegate.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think once you've played around with something for a minute, you can say, "Oh, okay, I don't need to do this update on my website anymore. I could hire a virtual assistant for that." But until have the page kind of set up, there are just certain things that until you've done it, you don't know how to explain how to do it to somebody else. But if you find yourself then doing something over and over again, you're like, well, this is easily explainable. I could write this up in a few short sentences. That means it's time to get it off my plate and send it off to somebody else.
Yeah. Were there any parts in the planning process that turned out to be more or less difficult than you expected them to be?
I think the setting up the schedule was extremely, I don't want to say it was difficult as in it was hard to do, but it was kind of emotionally fraught for me in a lot of ways. I had invited a number of speakers that ticked a bunch of different boxes in terms of, okay, they can talk about finding your readers through marketing, through communication, through your craft, all of these different things. I was like, I have a wonderful stable of amazing speakers who are going to be there. And but actually the details of, all right, what panels are we going to have? Who's going to speak when? That that tripped me up for a long time. And I think part of it was just getting to the point where I was like, oh my gosh, as soon as I set this, who am I to like, who am I to say what we're going to talk about and when? And I was really hung up on this, like, oh, I guess imposter syndrome, right? Of like, I'm deciding this. Who am I to say that? And I was saying that to my husband once, and he's like, you're the conference organizer. That's who to say what we're talking about.
Oh, yeah.
So that really triggered something for a long time where I was like, okay, to my speakers, I had to be like, I'm so sorry that it's taken me so long to get the schedule. But in my mind, it was like, sorry, I was just I was hanging over here and like spiral land for a while about it.
Yeah. I can imagine for any of these kind of big endeavors like organizing a conference, it would be helpful for people sort of ahead of time to rehearse.
Mhm.
Like, I'm going to be talking to this big name author, and then I'm going to have to tell them this or ask them this or insist on this. And do I feel comfortable about that? Like, both intellectually comfortable. I guess I am the organizer, and then also sort of psychically comfortable, like, yeah,
Mhm.
just exactly you were saying.
Yeah, I read something the other day in a newsletter from a copywriter whose newsletter I'm on, and he was talking about how uh, how ego can really get in your way of putting yourself out there. And he was saying, normally we think of ego in terms of, I think I'm so great. And that is, that's kind of more the hubris side of ego. But he was saying what trips people up so often is the flip side of ego, which is just you thinking about yourself and worrying about what people are thinking about you when really everyone's thinking about themselves and not about you. So I think that where I'm going with that is, when you're going to a conference, I think so many people are like, oh, what will I say if somebody asks me this? Or what will people think about this? And honestly, nobody's really thinking that much about you. And I was so tripped up on my own ego of like, what will people think that I'm making these decisions? And like, people were just excited about the conference. They weren't worried about, oh, Jesse thought we would do blah, blah, blah. So letting this
Where does she
ego.
get off?
Yeah.
So I was curious also to talk about the how you ended up with the speakers. So I can imagine in not necessarily your conference, but in other situations, there would be two ways of going about it. One is I've developed this network of people who know a lot about X, and I'd love to get them together and do a conference about X. Or I want to do a conference about X, and now I'm looking among my network of people to see who I have that could contribute to that. Does one of those sound more like what you did for your conference than the other?
Yeah, it was definitely more of the first one. I was looking at my network and thinking, who can I ask that will probably say yes to me or at least will entertain the idea or won't be like, wait, who are you? And why would I fly all the way to Portland for you? So I definitely did start with who I knew and compiled those people and then sort of built the conference around them. And one of the things that I will definitely be doing a little differently for next year is thinking more about the schedule ahead of time and the topics that I want to cover, and then finding the people to fill those pieces. Because as I've now established this event, I can point to it and say, here, I did this thing. Here's some rave reviews from people. And so would you like to come? And I'm already kind of hearing that from some people that have reached out and said, oh, I'd love to be invited for next year, which is a really great place to be in. But I definitely did start with who do I know that might say yes?
And did you have to exercise any ego adjustment in order to approach those people that you wanted to involve?
Oh my gosh, yes. That was one of the scariest parts was that and emailing speaker or sponsors to ask about sponsorships. Those were, I would just put those emails off for hours, for days. I would be in cold sweats just thinking about, I just need to email this person and invite them to my conference. And again, like you said, that was my ego getting in the way and thinking, what will they think about this? And my husband's in sales. So he was just like, people get these kinds of requests day in and day out. And what do they do if they don't want to do it? They say no and they move on and they don't think about you again. They're not upset with you. He's like,
Yeah.
why are you so worried about asking sponsors for money? That's what they do. Like,
Did you find that you had to take a different approach between organizations that you were requesting sponsorships from and speakers that you were expressing interest in them as speakers?
I think the sponsorship was harder for me just because it was straight up asking for money. And I'm like, what, again, who am I? What am I offering you? But the speakers, I did feel a little bit more like, okay, well, I'm inviting you to this opportunity and, you're going to get something out of it. We're all going to get something out of it. And I really had to adjust my mind on sponsors as well, because I was also inviting them to an opportunity and I wasn't asking for a handout. I was selling advertising. And so I think once I switched that a little bit and was like, all right, if I think about it like selling advertising as opposed to asking for money, then it feels very different. And so that's, I think, what finally got me over that hurdle.
Yeah, I think that's clearly very generalizable too, because I know for when I'm doing promotional stuff, I don't think that the promotion stuff is ever super comfortable for an author. But if you think of it as the underlying cause is you're trying to get what you have to offer in front of people that you believe it could benefit, that not only makes it easier, there's going to be value on both sides, But I think it also helps to identify who your target audience is. Like if
Mhm.
you're mentally preparing a pitch to, some indie author organization, let's say, and you can't clearly define what the benefit is to them in partnering with you, then maybe you're not pitching the right group in the same way that if you're trying to present your book to an audience and it's feeling like a mismatch, then maybe it's because it's a mismatch. Maybe if you can't articulate the value to the person that you're targeting, then that's a red flag.
Yeah, because it really should be about whether it's a partnership or whether you're trying to make a book sale, it should be about your customer, your audience, and what is the benefit for them instead of saying, hey, can you do me a favor and buy my book? Or
Right.
can you do me a favor and review my book? Even, that kind of ask. People are like, that's why people get, I think, so hung up on it
Yep.
is that you feel like you're asking for favors, which you're not. You're a business owner and you're providing a service. That service is entertaining and educational books. And if your message isn't hitting what your audience is looking for, then yeah, you're right. There's a mismatch. It's not that you're needing to beg more. It shouldn't be about begging, it's about selling. And
Hmm.
yeah, it's a different mindset switch for sure.
Yep. So, one of the things that I know people will be able to empathize with is this idea of what happens when you take on a huge project like this. And it's not like you have 20 spare hours in the week that you just didn't know what to do with before, but now you're having to balance this with all the other things that are on your plate. How did you do that? Especially because you have a ghostwriting, copywriting business. And so, it's both your work and work you're doing for other people.
Yeah, that was tough to balance. And I definitely didn't get as much writing as I wanted to last year done, which yeah. So that was something that I kind of had to ask myself from time to time, especially I had an injury last year and had sort of a rough patch. And I knew going as I was kind of getting back to things, I was like, I only have room for one project. And is it organizing this conference? Because people will absolutely be like, oh, I understand that you're calling this off. Or is it writing the next book in my series? And to me, the value of bringing all these people together and doing something that was for the community that was very, very much supporting me during that rough patch was like, that's winning out over finishing this book. So it did, I didn't do it all. People are like, oh my gosh, I can't believe you can do everything. And I didn't, I can't. It's been a year since I finished my last book and I'm still on like act two of my current one. So, it's just about setting the priorities and figuring out what is the most important draw for you and why is that so valuable. But in terms of, I guess, actual, productivity and balance, I tried to focus where I'd be like, okay, today is a day where I'm just working on conference stuff. Tomorrow I will just work on this one client project. And I work better when I'm not bouncing around and instead just focusing on one project at a time. So when I'm juggling multiple projects like I was with this conference, I would segment it out by days, more or less, as much as I could, and say, okay, I will only take meetings on Tuesdays, and I will only work on my fiction if I have a chance to on Fridays or whatever it was. And I kind of set myself that schedule.
Yeah, I'm definitely a big proponent of task switching as little as possible. And I know, looking back at my corporate life, I realized that one of the reasons that people in a corporate environment can be so inefficient is that you're task switching like every 15 minutes.
Yeah.
Whereas once I was working for myself and I could segment out the time as I wanted to, I became much more efficient. And now I'm always experimenting with what's the perfect focus or what's the perfect duration of that chunk of time that I'm allocating. Like, is it an hour? Is it half day? Is it a day? Is it a week? I'm currently trying to juggle a nonfiction book that I didn't plan to have take up all my time, but I got into this, probably a virtuous situation where the words were coming really easily. And so every morning I would get up, I would get my tea, I would sit down, and I was like, okay, I could go back to my fiction book, which I'm really excited about, or I can roll along with this because, it's going easily for me. It's going quickly for me. And I think that those decisions about how to chunk out and then obviously allocating the time, but then chunking it out, like, do I just say, okay, this month is going to be nonfiction book month, or do I say this week is going to be nonfiction, whatever that is, just as you were saying, today is just going to be conference stuff, but tomorrow is going to be fiction writing or what have you.
Yeah, I think to your point about following the flow of your energy, that's one of the most productive things that you can do, especially if you do have control over your time, where you don't have to be like, well, I have to stop this and work on this other thing. I mean, I said that I kind of set myself these schedules, but besides basically just only taking meetings 1 or 2 days a week, everything else is a little bit flexible. So if I wake up in the morning and I I'm brimming with ideas for essays that I want to write for, my newsletter, then I will just, okay, you know what? I got to get this out. There's no point in focusing on whatever I said I was going to do this morning and then trying to write that essay later because the words want to come out right now. So it's going to be most efficient to get them out right now. So it does, yeah, I think following the flow of your energy is really huge. But then I will sometimes follow the flow of my energy to the point where I haven't responded to emails for a few days. And
Yeah.
you have to find a little balance of like, no, okay, you do need to set aside that 30 minutes at the end of the day and clean out your inbox or whatever it is.
Yep. Another thing that I know you spend a lot of time planning for your conference, and I think that conference attendees can gain a lot from this, is this idea of wanting to emphasize community building, but knowing you were catering to a group of people, many of whom were going to be introverts. So, how did you handle that, making a comfortable environment for introverts?
Yes, that is something that's like a question like networking for introverts is a question that I get asked a lot because I am very much an introvert, but I have trained myself to get out there and go to networking events and get up and like go talk to somebody, introduce myself to in a conversation. And I've definitely had people newer, whether newer writers or just newer extroverting like that, be like, "Can you just walk up and talk to somebody? Like, how does that work? Explain how you just like started a conversation." So I really did, like you said, wanted to create a environment where it was easy to have these sparked up conversations. And part of that was we had like a happy hour Thursday before the conference started where people could pick up their packets and we had snacks and some drinks and you could just hang out and talk. And so I had a few key people in the room that I knew were a little more chatty and I'd be like, all right, I need you to keep an eye out. If you see somebody by themselves, like go talk to them. And I was doing a bit of that myself because, like I said, my husband at that point was like, my husband and Lydia were like, okay, we've got all the food, we've got everything else. You just mingle. That's your job. So I was very much on the lookout for, hey, a new person's here. I need you to go meet this person. So I was facilitating a lot of kind of meetings between people that I was like, I know you two will get along, or you have questions about this, or you're both just starting a new Ream subscription or whatever it is. So I did a lot of that. And then the other thing that I was very deliberate about was meals. So I know if you've been to a conference where you're trying to figure out what to do for lunch and everyone breaks, and then you look around and you spent 2 minutes too long in the bathroom and suddenly everyone's gone and you have no one to have lunch with, that can be really frustrating. And so we catered breakfast and lunch in the event space itself. So people could show up early, grab a bagel or, a yogurt or whatever. And often people would sit at the same place on the table so they'd get a chance to talk with their table mates or meet somebody new. And then at lunch, we did breakout sessions right before lunch. So you would be in a group with your individual speaker or with an individual speaker and maybe some other people. And so, sometimes these conversations, people would want to keep them going, but you could say, okay, well, food's ready. I'm going to go grab some food and let's keep talking about this. Or, you know what? I'm a little bit tired of talking. So I'm going to grab a plate and head up to my room for a while. But you didn't have to try to figure out where to go for lunch or how many people or do we need a reservation or any of that stuff. So I, that was, I think, really critical.
Yeah, I think there are two lessons to be gleaned from that more generally beyond conferences. And one is that idea that you had found helpers to help with the tactics, the logistical details, whereas you could focus on the more like strategic aspect of introductions and pairing people up appropriately and things like that is super important in the same way that indie authors, for example, who get too deep into the now I'm gonna try once again to make my own book cover. Just let somebody else who's good at that take care of that and let you focus on what you're best at. And then the other thing is this idea that you may not have ever organized a conference before, but you had obviously been to a lot of conferences, which I think was key because you knew, maybe you didn't know the details of how to address it, but you knew that, the dynamic of spending 2 minutes too long in the restroom and what happens when you come out and everybody's gone. So I think the analogy there might be you have to have read a lot of books in order to write books. You have to have been to a lot of whatever the community is you want to build in order to be able to effectively create a community. Because if you hadn't had those experiences as an attendee, these things wouldn't have even occurred to you of what you had to factor in for your own.
Right. And I mean, going back to how when I first started organizing this, I asked everyone I knew who had organized a conference. I I quizzed everybody about you've been to conferences. What did you like? What didn't you like? I sent out surveys. Whenever somebody joined the marketing list for the conference, they got a link to fill out a survey about their preferences and what were some of their favorite things, what were frustrations of other conferences. So I really just kept asking around and gaining as much other people's experiences as possible. Because that's one thing. I mean, I think we know this as writers. One of the joys of especially fiction is that it gives your readers a chance to live lives that they haven't lived before and experience new things and learn new things through that story. And you can do that yourself if you don't know how to do something. You can tap into your network of people who might have done that before and get their opinions. You can ring up experts. I mean, I'm not ringing them up, but shoot an email to somebody or follow them on Twitter and hear their perspective and be like, oh, okay, now I'm getting some ideas here. Like there are ways to, if you don't know how to do something, whether it's finding an editor or whether it's how to write a certain type of character, there are so many resources out there if you just kind of listen and learn.
Yeah. I wanted to circle back to the community idea. And, you went into this with a robust community, as evidenced by the fact you could tap into them for speakers, you could tap into them for attendees. And now you probably have an even bigger network. So, do you have any tips for how you're capitalizing on that expanded community, both for your own benefit and the benefit of the new people in your community, that's paving the way? Maybe it's not even paving the way for the next conference. It certainly is, but maybe helping out in other ways as well. Are there tips you can share about how to keep those relationships vital after maybe an event that everybody's come together for?
Mhm. I think one of the things that people don't do after an event is follow up with the people that they met. And, you might get business cards, you might exchange emails with somebody, and so many people just don't actually send that follow up email saying, hey, it was so good to meet you. I'd love to keep in touch. I often tell people at conferences, like, oh, yeah, if you ever have questions and want to just chat, like, I'm happy to Zoom with you. And I can count on one hand the number of people who've actually taken me up on that. So I think we have a tendency to get home from an event like that and to think, oh, well, now everyone's busy or they were just being nice or whatever it is. And so I guess my first piece of advice for kind of expanding your community, especially after an event that you might have attended, is actually follow up. Take people at their face value. If they say, oh, I'd love to meet for coffee or I'd be happy to answer your questions via email, like hopefully they're not saying that just to be nice. And if they are, then they've learned their lesson and they won't say that to the next person. Take advantage of it. If somebody says, email me, go ahead and email them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great advice. I know that you and I have kept in touch along with some other attendees of 20 books, and that has been very valuable to me for a number of reasons. So I'm a big fan of that.
Mhm.
So, Jessie, thank you so much for sharing all those perspectives. Please let the listeners and viewers know where they can go to find out more about you and your upcoming conference and everything else you do online.
Yeah, thank you so much. This has been such a great conversation. So you can find more about me at jessiekwak.com. That's JESSIEKWAK. That will have links to the Author Alchemy Summit website. And the dates for next year are locked in now. It's February 14th through 16th, 2025.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jessie. Are you thinking about organizing a conference of your own now? If not, which of her tips are you going to apply to another major undertaking you're considering or are working on now? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube and please subscribe while you're there. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Matty a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee to make a small contribution via PayPal or Stripe. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.